Last week I talked about something that I called the rigid rule of all or nothing factual dependence or factual independence. And the idea of that rigid rule is that if Matthew and or Luke is using Mark as a factual source, then for that story they're not adding any factual correct information themselves from some independent source. So dependence and independence have to be all or nothing. Today I want to talk about how that rigid rule applies to a minor difference in wording in the story of the healing of Jairus' daughter. Now, this is minor. It's a minor difference between Matthew on the one hand and Mark and Luke on the other. And the difference goes like this. In Mark's gospel, Jairus comes and he says to Jesus, "My daughter is dying." We'll talk a little bit in a moment about the exact idiom there, but "my daughter's dying" it's a good translation. And in Luke, it reports it indirectly. He came and begged him to come to his house because his daughter was dying. Very similar. In Matthew, it says, "My daughter has now died," or has just now died. That's what Jairus said. And then in Mark and Luke, there are messengers who come and say, "Don't bother Jesus. She's dead. It's too late." And Jesus encourages Jairus to not be discouraged and to have faith and so forth, and continues and goes on and raises her from the dead. No messengers are reported in Matthew. So that's the minor difference. This is an example of one of the synoptic differences that I call a gateway drug to fact-changing literary devices. And the reason that I use that phrase gateway drug is because it so often happens that someone will be introduced to this notion that the gospel authors invisibly changed facts by way of something that sounds extremely trivial, and then it sounds like no big deal, and they accept that, and then they kind of go on saying, well, that's no big deal, that's no big deal, that's no big deal, with things that are bigger and bigger and bigger deals. So you start with, well, it's no big deal if Matthew changed it, because that's the theory, and made Jairus' daughter die before he left the house, and he knew that she had died, and everybody knew that he knew that she had died, and he came and said that to Jesus, even though that's not the way it really happened. That seems like a minor change, and then later it's, it's no big deal if John added "I thirst," even though Jesus never said it, added "it is finished," even though Jesus never said it, if Luke changed the entire circumstances in which Jesus first met his disciples after his resurrection. Oh, well, it's no big deal. Big picture is Jesus somehow, somewhere met his disciples after his resurrection and so forth. And I've observed this, okay? I'm not saying it's inevitable. I'm not saying it's an absolutely inevitable slippery slope, but I've observed it happening for sure. Because once the person accepts the idea that the gospel authors deliberately changed the fact, then they're kind of like, gee, how can I make a principled objection somewhere else? And so the way that the gateway drug passages work is it's something that sounds minor, and it is minor if it's not a deliberate change. But what's not recognized is you can't port that minorness over to a deliberate change. It's a much bigger deal for someone to say, I'm going to make this happen earlier and narrate it deliberately that way, not give any indication to the contrary. Even the original audience couldn't tell that it didn't happen that way when they heard it or read it, because then it changes the way that author is related to truth. And I've talked about that elsewhere, and I won't belabor it anymore here, but that's why the function of this as a kind of a gateway drug to fact-changing literary devices is so misleading, because the fact that something's minor as a non-deliberate difference doesn't mean that it follows that it's minor, that a person changed it deliberately. The other thing is that a word like compression will be used, and there's a conflation between saying that an author merely left something out. He wasn't trying to make it look like that didn't happen. He just wasn't taking the time to narrate it. And saying that he left it out because he was trying to make it look like it didn't happen and make it appear that something took place over a shorter time period deliberately than it really did. So then there's this, oh, yeah, compression. I mean, sometimes you just tell a shorter version, the guy version, as opposed to the girl version, and conflating a fact-changing and a non-fact-changing activity. So that's why I want to talk about this, and I want to show, too, how that rigid rule of factual independence has to be all or nothing is playing into this. You may remember that the quotation I read last week was apropos of the healing of Jairus' daughter, but then the more broad principle was something that Dr. Lacuna stated, which was that we should be essentially reluctant or hesitant to attribute differences in the synoptics to witness variation, natural witness variation, if Matthew and or Luke is using Mark. Well, why? Okay, the principle that has to lie behind that is this all or nothing dependence idea, that if Matthew is using Mark, that apparently he doesn't have separate sources of information about what really happened. And as we saw last time, that doesn't follow at all. It's not even just that it isn't an absolutely necessary thing. It's not even all that probable. He could be just using Mark as a kind of a linguistic pony, as you call it, when you partially copy something or use something to prompt yourself as you're writing, but not constraining himself then to only report what's in Mark or change it deliberately from what factually happened. He could still have other sources of information about what happened. In the case of Jairus' daughter, there are several natural possibilities. My daughter has just died versus my daughter is dying. Now, one of them is that Jairus only said one thing, but that people who were there were standing in different places and heard the wording a little bit differently, or that different people who were there remembered the wording a little differently. That happens all the time. So that if you heard him say something about his daughter and death, all right, one person might hear it as his daughter's dying, and another person hear it as his daughter's dead. Even more plausibly, one person, even over a few years, could remember it as his daughter's dead. His daughter has just died. Especially given that it turned out that she was dead by the time they got back to the house, then that could change the memory a little bit, as if maybe she was already dead by that time. And just that slight variation in memory, which again argues for independent, to some extent, witnesses, because that's what we find in different witnesses who witness the same thing. They can remember the wording just a little bit differently. That could potentially be called an error. It would be a minor error, but it could be called an error. But it would be much more probable than this really heavy thing, and I'll be talking later about the rigid rule of deliberateness, where Matthew's like, I want to make the daughter die sooner. I know that she wasn't actually already dead by the time he left the house to come find Jesus, but I'm going to make her die before he leaves the house. Just people remembering what Jairus said a little bit differently is a much more natural kind of scenario. But there's another pretty natural kind of scenario, and hear me out on this, and don't go, this is that kind of, hatred for any additive harmonization that kicks in. But again, think about the naturalness of this in a real world scenario. Activate your real world imagination. Jairus knows that she's almost dead. Okay, he knows that she's right at the very, very end of her life. It takes some time. Now, it's in walking distance, but still takes some time for him to get from his house to Jesus. And there's a huge crowd. We know there's a huge crowd because of the story of the woman with the issue of blood who touches Jesus as he's going to Jairus' house, crowding around. Takes him a while. Excuse me, right? He's kind of trying to get through the crowd, and somebody's like, watch who you're pushing, right? And it takes him some time to get through, to get to Jesus to hear him and beg him to come. And if she was almost dead when he left, all right, he's thinking in his mind, is she still alive or isn't she? Okay, he's like distraught, and he could say, my daughter's dying. She's right at the end, and I'll talk about that idiom in a second. By now, she's probably dead. My daughter, and again, the word now is there in Matthew. My daughter has now died. She's dead by now. Okay. He could easily say both. In fact, he could even have said to a disciple, who seemed to be, sort of trying to clear a little space around Jesus, can the master please come? My daughter's dying. She's right at the end. And then, Jesus looks at him and he falls down on the ground. Master, please come. My daughter's just died. Okay. Actually, that's very plausible. And my attention was drawn to the wording of what it says in Mark by Craig Blomberg in one of his books. I can't remember if it's his Reliability of the Gospels, but anyway, he quotes the Greek in Matthew there, and he quotes the Greek in Mark, and he says, really, there's not much distance between these. If you look up in Greek text analysis in Mark, the Greek in Mark is this kind of unusual idiom. To us it seems unusual. Maybe it wasn't unusual, but my daughter is holding at the end. And idioms, when you translate them, literalistically like that, they do sound strange to people who speak other languages, but we have idioms very much like that. My daughter's at the end of her rope. My daughter is hanging on by her fingernails. All right? My daughter's almost dead. She's hanging on. Just barely hanging on. That would be another way to word it. And that's essentially what he said. And Blomberg says, there isn't that much difference between these. Now, between this and my daughter has now died, as recorded in Matthew. Now, that can fit with either the slight difference in memory on the part of different people or with his saying both. And Blomberg doesn't go into those specifics, but he just points out that the expressions aren't that different. The reason it can be explained by his saying both is that he could be worried that she has now died, just now, since he knew she was barely holding on when he left, and he knew that it had taken him some time to get there. So the closeness in meaning of those two actually, in a way, makes it not implausible that he said both. Okay. Now, something that you will hear is that Matthew wanted to shorten it, so he had to make her die earlier. And that's not really true. So the implication there is he was forced to change the time when she died, forced to change the status of Jairus' knowledge in order to get rid of the messengers. Now why? Okay, if you just wanted to leave out the messengers without implying that they didn't come, you can leave things out without implying that the things didn't happen, but you're just trying to tell the story shorter. That's not fact-changing compression. You can just say when they arrived at the house, they saw the mourners, for the maid was dead, or for the maid had died. Okay, that's it. Little sentence that you put in there. So if Matthew knew that Jairus said, my daughter is dying, and did not say, my daughter has died. Like, if he definitely knew that he did not say the second of those two, he could have reported, my daughter is dying, and then just thrown in that one little sentence. Leave out the messengers because he doesn't want to lengthen his story, not implying that they didn't come. But then when they get there, just put in this little sentence, for the maid was dead. When they get there, they explain the presence of the mourners. So it would not be necessary. It's not like the minute you say, oh yeah, I guess he wanted to compress the story, then you're forced to accept, I guess he had to change the time when she died. That does not follow. Again, we gotta get away from this rigidity that any change from Mark has to be a deliberate change, and has to be a deliberate change of fact because of all or nothing dependence. Got to get away from that. Now, one argument that Dr. Lacona makes is that he says it would sound strange if Jairus said she is dead, she has died, and if Matthew then reported that the messengers came and said, don't bother Jesus, she's dead. It's not clear exactly what point he's making with that, but it seems to be that he's implying that Matthew must have been trying to make it look like the messengers didn't come. That to report Jairus as saying she's now died, she has now died, is, ipso facto to be committed to making it look like in the story no messengers came. Okay, so you think about that, it's like, okay, if Matthew thought that she said, or thought that he said, my daughter has died, then Matthew would have to think that the messengers didn't come. Or if Matthew's trying to make it look like he said, my daughter has died, Matthew is forced to make it look like no messengers came. So not leaving them out just to shorten, but actually leaving them out to try to imply that they didn't come. Because, it would be so weird, it wouldn't happen, in other words, in a real story that he would say, my daughter has died, and then they would come and say, don't bother Jesus, your daughter has died. Oh, that's really weird. It wouldn't happen that way. So that then his omission of the messengers must be attempting to make it look like there were no messengers, which is a stronger claim. Well, even that isn't necessarily true. So not only is it not true that if he's going to shorten the story, he has to, by leaving out the messengers, he has to make it look like she was already dead before Jairus came. It's also not true that if he's going to record Jairus as saying she has died, he has to try to make it look like the messengers didn't come. It doesn't work either way, and here's why. In real life, scrambly emergency situations, such as this was, you don't always know what the other guy knows. Okay, so and remember, there's no heart monitor going beep 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 like on the TV, right? Like, oh, she flatlined, we couldn't get her back. There's nothing like that. What would they have? Well, you could maybe put your ear down to the chest to try to hear. Sometimes read, I don't know if they did this, but you would take something maybe polished and put it in front of her lips to, see if there was a breath. Maybe put your hand to try to feel if she was breathing. Try to watch if her chest is rising and falling. But it can be hard to tell, when a person has died. So if Jairus is there and she is barely breathing, these very shallow breaths, and he gets up and he rushes out because he hears Jesus is nearby to try to find Jesus, get Jesus to come, maybe just at the time that she takes her final breath, then there could be people back at the house who then definitely determine she's dead. And they're like, oh, Jairus went to get Jesus. Maybe he didn't know that she died just as he left. So, no point in getting Jesus. They think Jesus can't raise the dead, right? Maybe he could have healed her, but he can't raise the dead. So they're like, go, let's go tell him not to bother Jesus. So even if she was dead before his feet left the house, it doesn't follow that he knew it, and it doesn't follow that other people knew that he knew it, and therefore the messengers could have a purpose, right? Don't bother the master, she's dead. Maybe you didn't realize, okay, but there's no point at this point. So in real life, that could actually even have happened, even if she had died just as he was leaving or just before he left the house. Okay, so all of these possibilities are in play here. And if we don't insist upon a rigid rule of independence, all or nothing, or dependence, all or nothing, upon Mark's version, we can allow Matthew to be reporting things in a somewhat different way that arise, yes, perhaps from his desire benignly to shorten the story by leaving out the messengers, but not by trying to make it look like the messengers weren't there. You can leave things out without trying to make it look like it didn't happen. I know I'm repeating myself, but you got to bear it in mind. But also from actual variation of information, be it someone remembering the words slightly differently, even though Jairus only said one thing, or because two or more different people remember the words differently because Jairus actually said more than one thing in his distraught state, and knowing that she was holding at the end before he left. So we really got to try to think in a less rigid fashion. And the way to do that is not to be intimidated by somebody saying, most scholars agree with me, and this is how you got to do it, and adopting that as a kind of a passkey to look like you're sophisticated and you understand the synoptic problem, because you can definitely understand the synoptic problem, or the synoptic puzzle, as I like to put it, without adopting these rigid rules. Okay, come back next time. I have a list somewhere here of what other rigidity videos I'm going to do, but I don't remember which one I was planning to do next time, but it'll still be on rigidity and New Testament scholars. So I'll see you then. Like and subscribe.